what is modern literature, and when does it begin, and when does it end, if at all? So in fact, the word modern exists in English from the 13th century. The critical theorist Jürgen Habermas, in an essay called Modernity, an Incomplete Project, he points out that the word actually goes back to the 5th century. There's a Latin word, modernus, which means of the time or of the mode. Back in the 15th century in Latin, it's used to differentiate Christian civilization from pagan civilization. Christian is modernus. It's used to contrast the present, even in the 15th century or the 13th century, with the present, and to make it clear that it's categorically different from the past. So the word is one that announces a new beginning, but in relation to a tradition that it reacts against and supersedes. And you might think now about how many of the works of literature we read that evoke tradition. Like The Wasteland just quotes everything from the tradition. That puts it to new use. In the 18th century, there's a famous ongoing debate between the ancients and the moderns too, reflecting the sense that the modern writers are different from the past, but also it implies a breakaway from the past, from relations to the past. So modernity and tradition are opposed, but in a paradoxical way. There's a famous essay that everybody quotes these days by Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, called The Painter of Modern Life, who talks about the process of creating modern art where the painter goes out to capture what he sees as new and fresh and interesting, and he goes back to the studio to paint it, and it's already old by the time he gets there and puts it on the canvas, because modern life moves at such a fast pace. So when you run across these words these days in the academy, modernism is understood to be the artistic or aesthetic reaction to a bigger process known as modernization. These are two different words and concepts. Modernism is what happens in the arts, and modernization is the process, the project of technological and social change that brings about the formation of the modern world. It includes like the development of industry and infrastructure, of technology and so forth. So modernization in turn is a host of forces that introduces novelty in the world and makes it different from the past. So where does the modern period begin? According to some people, it begins in the 13th century. And those of you in the English department here at Berkeley know that some people call Renaissance literature early modern literature because it's in the 13th century that you start to see the growth of a middle class. And that signifies a social shift from the world of feudalism and aristocracy where everything is hierarchical. So maybe in the 13th century. And also at this time, the Protestant Reformation is in full force, and Protestantism, of course, places emphasis, interpretive emphasis on the individual. It's not the priest or authority who tells you what's right or wrong in Protestant vision, but your own judgment to working with the Bible. So the individual becomes like an independent interpreter without authority. And the emphasis on the individual in middle-class culture also meant an emphasis not simply on individual interpretation of Scripture, but of individual observation, which leads, of course, to the idea of experimentation in science. And so the Protestant Reformation helps to bring about the advent of modern science, and with it all the technological changes that ensure the coming of the city and modernity. Some people locate the origins of modernism in the 18th century, the Age of Reason, when the Enlightenment comes along and brings us processes that enable science to flourish and rationality. Other people see modernism beginning with the Romantic Revolution, when anybody can be an authority in anything without being schooled because you know how you feel and you have the authority of your feelings. So if you think about the course of social history I've just traced out, the path of authority from the Middle Ages to the early 20th century is downward, out of the sky, and inward into the mind. Authority becomes the property of the interpreter. So a lot of people see the advent of modernization, this process, as distinct from modern art, roughly in the 18th century, which sees the urbanization of England and America. And in general, there's a huge shift in the way people live lives that takes place around the 17th and 18th century. Before the 17th century, life was feudal. Afterwards, as people move from the country to the city, it becomes a capital. and as opposed to rural or agrarian, urban. One way of measuring the distance between these cultures is to look at the word fee, which goes with capital. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon word fee, which means cow or cattle. And the German word for cow is fee. And people used to barter with cattle. If you wanted to buy something, you would exchange cattle. Now, fortunately, we have paper money so that everybody doesn't have to be walking around with their own herd of animals. There's also a shift politically from an aristocratic and hierarchical social structure to one that's democratic. And where emphasis is on the individual as opposed to the lord or the owner of the estate, authorities in the individual. Now, people in different disciplines have characterized the transformation that changes culture in this way. Historians call it the Great Transformation. The instauration of cities become the kind of center of human life with the Great Transformation. It's also the instauration of the Age of Reason. Recall the 17th century was a century of sectarian warfare and bloodshed, and as people started to aggregate in the city, rules had to be developed to allow them to get along politely, rules of decorum, manners, of urbanity, and these are the processes that lead to the valorization of reason and reasonability as what people should, as opposed to fanaticism and sectarian hatred. Rationality becomes the norm for civilized behavior. T.S. Eliot called this transformation the dissociation of sensibility in an essay he writes on the metaphysical poets, arguing that before the founding of cities, modern cities, people's intellectual lives and emotional lives weren't dissociated. He thinks that in the aftermath of the growth of cities, the intellectual life is divorced from the emotional life. This period has also been called the time of the invention of childhood. Think about the literature you've read over the course of your life and ask where you find representations of children in literature prior to the 18th century when John Locke comes along and starts writing about education and pedagogy. Before the Great Transformation, in particular the writing of John Locke, it was the practice just to tell children what to do, and they followed rules and obeyed pop. There was a practice called swaddling, in which a child was wrapped up like a mummy, wound up with claws in order to restrain the movements of its limbs, to teach it to be still. Within 10 years of John Locke's publishing a book that said the child should learn by experience as an individual, should be able to touch the bars of his crib and burn himself on a stove so he learns not to do that. Within 10 years, swaddling disappears as a custom. There are other transformations that take place in the home, too. Prior to the Great Transformation, people used to eat their meals out of things called trenchers, which were basically like long troughs, and everything would mess together. But as people started to value the individual and democracy, plates started to get developed so that everybody could accommodate their individual taste. It was also the habit before the transformation to sit in benches. Afterwards, everybody got their own chair. So we could go on and look at all these differential changes in customs that happened as we moved into the modern period. But modernism, and to be the long and short of this, is a relative term. And literature today is modern in relation to the past. As we can tell from all the literature we read, all of it kind of defines itself in relation to the past, not simply the poets who are quoting past literature right and left and putting it into new forms of arrangement, but The Sun Also Rises is imminently referring to the love story and writing it new and differently, just as Mrs. Dalloway is remaking the novel. Modern literature for me begins around the turn of this century. Something happens that makes the art of this period distinctly different, and for my temperament, exhilarating. I love the art of this period, which is why I teach it, and not simply literature, but the music and the painting too. So there's an interperiod, a kind of shady area between late Victorian and early modern, the years 1890 to 1914. Or maybe the beginnings of the modern period. The heyday of modernism is from the war, 1914, to the beginning of the Second World War, 1939, when Europe goes down the tubes. And when it comes out of World War II, something different is happening in literature, something that people have characterized as postmodernism. So modernism is, it occurs roughly in the period from 1910 to 1939, or 1890 to 1939, depending on how you fix it. And there's a debate about whether modernism is something that's periodic, that is, whether it's confined to a specific historical period, 1890 to 1939, or whether it's formal, whether it's a kind of property of art that makes it modern. And that argument is sustained most forcefully these days by people who see the kinds of writing that we've been reading, modern literature, being taken up anew, particularly in third world countries that are developing their own literatures and drawing on writers like Faulkner and Joyce and Woolf to create their own national literatures. So in that sense, modernism may still be alive. So in the usual tradition to which modernism is seen reacting is 19th century Victorian culture, which in poetry meant a lot of lyric poems about subjectivity and how you feel. Geez, wander down Telegraph Avenue and buy a book of poems from somebody who's selling poems, and you'll find lots of poems that begin with the word I and then some feeling. That kind of writing became embarrassing by the end of the 19th century, which explains why Eliot and Pound turned to a form of impersonal verse. In the novel, the dominant form of practice was realism or naturalism, which implied a kind of transparency between language and the world that's depicted by language. In the realistic novel, it's like the language is an instrument that's pointing to a reality that's there and behind the words, but the language is there just to point you to something that's more important. It's the language of science that informs realism and allows us to think of language actually mapping the real world and describing it. So, and also, to go back to the origins of Protestantism, one of the things that Luther's insistence that the individual interpreted the Bible meant was that people had to be able to read it, and that meant the development of dictionaries and reference works, and also reading practices. That in Luther's case, he suggested that you read the scripture for its Eindeutigkeit. Ein means one. Deutigkeit means meaning. The English word would be something like univocality. That is, you try to attach a single meaning to every word or to everything in the Bible and get it right instead of being allegorical and performing the kinds of operations that the church did to justify its hierarchy. So in the 20th century, by contrast, literature undergoes what Nietzsche called a linguistic turn, a revolution in the study of linguistics and language, in which language is regarded now as not transparent, not as an instrument that's pointing toward a reality that's always there, but as something that's arbitrary and man-made, and that has an arbitrary relation to things. What's the relation of the word tree to the thing that we see when we go outside there? Is there something inherent in the tree that makes it want to start with a word that begins with T, or is it just artificial? The sense is that it's artificial, and that these words are arbitrary concepts, and that has profound effects, because think about the meaning of the word human. Does it have a single meaning? The word human has been used throughout history to justify genocide, because all you have to do is say that one culture of people don't behave humanly. They have savage customs, they practice cannibalism, or they don't go to church, so they're not human, they're savage. So words have a profound effect on how we look at reality, and 20th century literature is aware of that. And so I would say that the first of the many shared properties in the literature that we read is a kind of aesthetic self-reflexiveness or reflection. All the writers we've read make their own media, which is words and language and storytelling. Part of their subject, the objects of study, the language itself is part of the story. And that happens because art and language are not merely reflectors of a given reality in the 20th century. Words are seen to create reality. Maybe you can see that most clearly in Absalom, where by the end of the book, given just a few scraps of stories and narratives, Quentin and Shreve are inventing a whole history of the 19th century in the South, just out of stories and fabrications. Or think about James. The characters in James are not always talking about real-world events. There's a lot of talk about talk, and you cannot avoid looking at James's style. You can't read that story and just pretend the style's not there. It's impossible with Henry James. Instead, you have to pay attention to the way the language is working and see how it clarifies Marcher's fate, for instance, at the same time that it's concealing and hiding and evading, showing us how the stories that people tell each other hide and evade as much as they conceal. You know, at the heart of that story, we have the characters saying things like, "What do you mean?" And she says, "You know what I mean." And he says, "I think I know what you mean." And she says, "I don't think I mean what you think I mean." There's dialogue like that in the story. And then in Faulkner, of course, you cannot just get to the Sutpens without having to listen to the speakers who tell the stories in their language too. The language is there as part of the story. And then in the poetry, we're also made aware of the medium because nothing is told straightforwardly in any of the stuff we've read, not the poetry, not the novels. In the poetry, we get fragments, and we're left with the question of how these things go together or how they connect, instead of just reading transparently through a poem the way you could say in the 19th century, reading one of Wordsworth's lyrics on clouds. We have to work to see how things fit together as ideogram and pound, or as fragments that are juxtaposed meaningfully in the wasteland. And Toomer's cane works like this too. It's a series of disjointed fragments that we have to ask about their unity. So I would say that this attention to the media in which they're working is a property of other arts that appear in the early 20th century too. In Cubism, for example, Picasso's practice, there's always a tension when you look at his painting between a sense of the flatness of the canvas, the two-dimensionality, and the illusion of perspective. And also he will draw pictures of ladies that are made out of geometric shapes, so that at one moment you're looking at what looks like a representation of something real, and at the other you're aware that this is just a construction made of geometry and flat shapes on a surface. And then in the theater too, the theater of Bertolt Brecht or Samuel Beckett, Brecht in a Threepenny Opera has a moment where one of the characters faces the audience and asks them to vote on what's going to happen in the play. And the idea of a character turning to the audience and engaging the audience, what he called the estrangement effect, and Fremdung. Geez, we're getting a lot of German in here today. Estranging effect, it takes you away from the idea that you're looking in on the life of other people, and reminds you you're in a theater watching a work of art. And in music, all of you can hum in your heads the beginning of The Rite of Spring, where Stravinsky has a bassoon playing at registers it was never meant to play at, so it sounds ethereal and weird. In The Firebird, he has the violinists in the string section turn over their bows and play with the wood, which makes this incredibly weird sound, ethereal, and so on and so forth. So as a result of this self-reflexivity and the attention to the media in which stories are being told in the 20th century, in modern literature, you generally find a weakening of straightforward storytelling. And this is in part an effect of the weakening of metanarratives. Like metafiction is beyond fiction, metanarrative is beyond narrative. Metanarrative is a term that's used in current theory for the big stories that explain everything, like the Judeo-Christian story, which tells us that if we're good and kind and self-sacrificial, we'll end up happy and in heaven. Or the story of 19th century science, which says that the mind can conquer nature and manage it, and we're progressing and everything's getting better and easier and more perfect. Or the indoctrinated story of middle-class success, which are told, don't give up on your dreams. If you believe in yourself and work for what you want, you'll get it. You always hear that story from the people who get it. You never hear it from the people who don't. There are a lot of those people, too. They had dreams and they worked hard and got nowhere. So in the 20th century, these meta-narratives, or these all-encompassing explanations for how the world works, lose their hold. In a place of clear storytelling, you get things like juxtaposition and montage, the putting together of discontinuities and fragments in the poetry, or contradictory stories in the novels, stories that efface each other or contradict. According to the critic Gregory Ulmer, quote, by most accounts, collage is the single most revolutionary formal innovation in artistic representation to occur in our century. And you might think about how many of these novelists and poets work by juxtaposing fragments against fragments, or take Mrs. Dalloway as a case in point, where you have multiple points of view looking at the same single thing, a single day. And some of those points of view, like Septimus's and Mrs. Dalloway's, are in utter conflict. So we've read some epic poems, The Wasteland and the Cantos, which have a large sweep but don't have a kind of narrative continuity or coherence. Things are put together in ways that suggest new unities, or that build fragment against fragment, as in the ideogram, or in Eliot's use of fragments, or in Picasso. I think I pointed out in the lecture on William Carlos Williams his construction of a bull's head from a bicycle. He took the bicycle seat for the head and the handlebars for the horns. And in doing so, he evoked two pasts, two cultures, as Eliot does in The Wasteland by juxtaposing 20th century life against the life of the past. So you can find other forms of juxtaposition and collage in this literature too, like in Ulysses, where Joyce is constantly foiling the activities of Mr. Leopold Bloom against those of his cultural forebear Ulysses, or for that matter, The Wasteland, where Eliot is juxtaposing his wandering and diffuse narrator to the Grail Knight. So in Woolf, Faulkner, and Hemingway, we get multiple points of view on one day in Mrs. Dalloway, on one man and family in Faulkner, and on a community in Hemingway, but no one point of view captures the whole story. Some of these novels are like looking at a mobile, where say Absalom, where you have different characters all kind of hovering around the same center, but none of them ever kind of getting there. So as a consequence, modern literature has been seen as a literature of paradox, ambiguity, and uncertainty. The realistic novel, crudely put, gives you the point of view of a character who learns how to adjust and fit into the world around him, usually middle-class society. It shows you what a well-managed or a badly managed life will get you, so that most of most novels in the realistic genre will end up with somebody getting married or discovering that they're really a noble person or getting a great job or position, or else, this is the middle class, or else if the character is a female, she gets a husband at the end and marries, or complement to that kind of novel is a novel that shows you how to botch your life in middle-class society. In that story, somebody ends up in prison. Crime and Punishment, for example. You kill somebody, you go to prison, and you don't end up assimilated to middle-class life. So the realistic novel is, in some sense, how to survive in the world of middle-class reality. One of my colleagues, D.A. Miller, has a great book called The Novel and the Police, which talks about the novel as a kind of policing institution. Father would bring it home in the 19th century and read it to the family in front of the fireplace, and it would tell you what you could get away with and what you couldn't. So in Jane Eyre, for example, you learn just how vociferous and aggressive a woman can be without getting shut up. Because if you scream too loudly, like Rochester's First Wife, you get shut up. But if you're angry like Jane, then you can get married. So it was kind of guidebook for a woman in the middle of the 19th century. So in a modern lit, though, in modern literature, though, with the collapse of meta-narratives, whether they're religion or science or omniscience, it's not clear if successful entry into the middle class is a good or bad thing. Think about Sutton's story. He got the American dream, and it turned out to kick him in the ass and be the American nightmare because of the way he got it and the people he hurt on his way to the top. So the same thing happens in Great Gatsby. He gets it in the end too. So it's not clear if making look at marriages in Faulkner or in Mrs. Dalloway for that example of getting married or acquiring a job is a good thing. And think about the end of Mrs. Dalloway for that matter. Is it a happy ending or a sad one? Has she sold out, and or has she reached paradise? Maybe some of both. And in Bloom, in Ulysses, is Bloom a modern-day equivalent of Ulysses, or he's just a kind of impotent sad sack? And in general, think back over the male characters we've read about in this literature, in James and Eliot and Hemingway and Joyce. The modern male is impotent and weak in comparison to his predecessor because all the stable kinds of categories of gendered behavior have collapsed, and especially in the aftermath of World War I, where the idea of male as a hero just got decimated. So another property of modern art, corollary to its pursuit of paradox and ambiguity, its portrayal of it breaks away from the portrayal of an integrated and individual subject. In the 19th century novel, the hero or heroine is the master or mistress of his own fate. He or she struggles with adversity, difficult people, and either triumphs or fails. But the implication is that the individual is the master of his fate and has control of his life. And you might think about Walt Whitman in this regard, very confidently in command of what he's going to do and doing it well. In the 20th century, by contrast, heroes and heroines are conflict-riddled and often self-sabotaging. Freud had taught most of these writers that no one really knows himself fully. In this regard, you might think of The Secret Sharer, where we learned that half of our attention is somewhere below the deck in an underworld that no one else sees. And we see this in Joyce as well, and even in Hemingway, where immense attention is given to keeping control of things, and that suggests that there are hidden things that need to be controlled, and that, of course, we want to look for once we see that an attempt is being made to not talk about them. And Faulkner shows us that our most committed, calculated, and deliberate actions, Sutphen's grand design, has vast unintended consequences that can't be foreseen. So setting out to achieve his design also releases the forces that come back for retribution and revenge and to seal his destiny. And then in Woolf, I think we see that people aren't really individuals, discrete and apart from each other, but exist in relations and of dependency. Everybody depends on everybody else in an integrated society. So it leads to a new model of being, I think, in the 20th century too, as opposed to the kind of self-contained, autonomous, self-governing individual that's at the heart of the realistic novel. Instead, we find 20th century heroes and heroines who are split subjects. They have divided minds, and part of what makes up their minds is not native to them. It's the language that they work with, in which these writers are self-conscious. So at the same time that we see all these destabilizing tendencies in modern art, there's an opposite tendency according to which, in some views, the deep structure of reality is still knowable or intellectually and culturally penetrable. So the process of uncovering or penetrating, moving beneath the surface and interpreting is felt, at least theoretically, to reveal or approach some essential sense of the world. Think of all the places in the literature we read where people talk about apocalypse. In The Second Coming, Yeats's poem, Closing Time in the Wasteland, it's closing time, or Elijah's coming in Ulysses. There's this, I think these emphasis on the apocalypse, which means taking the cover off of things, more etymology. The Greek word kalyptine means to cover or hide. And something that covers really well is eucalyptine, eucalyptus. Apocalypse means taking cover off and showing the real fabric of things. You get the sense that just one more trip through Absalom, conflating facts and cross-referencing details, will put you a little closer to the truth about Sutpen. And if you read it a fourth time, even a little closer and closer, so that you approach something that seems real. Just as one more reading of Mrs. Dalloway would get you closer to the heart of the moment that she's portraying in giving us this one day. Or in Pound or Eliot or Joyce, you get the sense that if you just penetrate the clutter of everyday life, you can get to the bottom of something that's accessible and real. Maybe the mythic consciousness that Eliot evokes in The Wasteland, or the unconscious, which for a brief period at the beginning of the 20th century becomes a new meta-narrative, something that can explain everything, at least for a while. At the same time, you get a clear sense that the process of understanding in high modernism art is unstoppable and never-ending. There's no amount to the interpretation you can do to any of the stuff we've read. Interpretation just goes on as long as a life does. And I wish we could have read all of Ulysses in this class. It's the greatest novel. But at one point, one of the characters tells a parable called the Pisgah side of Palestine. Mount Pisgah is the mountain from the top of which Moses saw the promised land. And as the parable is told in Ulysses, the idea is that your process of reading is going to be like Moses' trip through the desert to the top of Mount Pisgah. You're going to get to the top of the mountain and see the promised land of wrapped up meaning, but you're never going to get there. You're going to die before you get there. That's just the way it works, but you can see it off in the distance. So figures like those suggest that modernism, which is already self-reflective and self-conscious, implicitly carried within a critique of itself and its own limits. It strives to find, but doesn't believe it can find, a meaning that's complete and final and wrapped up. So that's in part, I think, why this literature emphasizes the fragment. The fragment becomes a new and ideal kind of form. Instead of having everything wired and wrapped up in a whole, the fragment presents things the way they are in life. There's one critique of modern literature that says it's totalitarian, that Eliot in The Wasteland and Pound and the Cantos and Joyce and Ulysses tries to imperialize everything and put everything in there. Ulysses has a reference to everything until the last chapter when Joyce crams in a woman, so that he's doing, like with the realm of human knowledge, what imperial culture does with the world. I don't see that. I see all of modern literature instead like valorizing the fragment, telling us that there's nothing whole, everything's a part. So, and it doesn't endorse the belief in progressive perfectibility or in the attainment of kind of intrapsychic unity. And instead, these, as the arguments and insights I've offered suggest, there's a line of continuity between modernism and postmodernism, the latter of which can be best understood as, and summed up as a critique of modernism's pretensions and its elitism and its posturing. People got impatient with it in the aftermath of World War II. So I'm going to now try to give a brief account of my understanding of the difference between, first of all, realism and naturalism, the aesthetic program of the 19th century, and then modernism, which I've been talking about, and then postmodernism. Postmodernism, a critic named Russell Berman has pointed out that it shifted meaning from an awkward neologism to a derelict cliche without ever retaining the dignity of a concept. It first appears actually in the 1930s in Spain. It gets the most usage in the it started to appear to be used mostly in the 1970s in architectural criticism. But it's a kind of program of art that proclaims its opposition to a lot that's done in the literature we've been looking at. For one thing, it commits itself to heterogeneity and fragmentation and difference as opposed to homogeneity and wholeness and totalitarian unity. It validates the fragment over the whole. But as I've said, I see modernism doing that too. And I don't see Joyce or Eliot or Pound kind of imperialistically wrapping everything up perfectly in their works. At the end of the canto, Pound says, I can't make it cohere. It doesn't cohere. The criticism of modern enterprise sets in after World War II, where with the growth, the explosion in culture after the war, the baby boom, and the growth of mass culture, no one is special anymore, and everybody's seen to be operating repetitively and iteratively, doing the same things over and over again, particularly in the kind of homogeneous, conformist culture of the American 1950s. The literature after World War II has been called the literature of exhaustion by John Barth. Pound used to say, make it new. In the aftermath of World War II, Barth and writers like him, Samuel Beckett, said there's nothing new. It's all been told. Every story's been told already. How many more love stories do we need to hear? There's nothing left to do that's new. And so literature becomes kind of, as in Nabokov, parodic. It starts quoting prior literature and talking about the way the world is built up of literature, or it resorts to a form of what's called pastiche, drawing on styles from other works of literature, or art, kind of like that building on the corner of Telegraph and Durant on the southwest side of the street. It's a postmodern building. It's got like features that look like columns, but they're not really columns. And it's got like fan lights that look like fan lights on Wheeler Hall, but they're not like fan lights on Wheeler Hall. It's quoting a lot of architecture of the past, but and doing it in a canny and knowing way. But it's not functional, it's just decorative. And I'm going to have to look at it for the rest of my life. So the belief in literature not being able to do anything new or special anymore is also deepened by the sense that art is somehow out of touch with life. It pretends to have a grip on life, but it's artificial. And some of this has to do with the atrocities that were visited upon culture by World War II, with the death camps and the prospect of nuclear annihilation. The Frankfurt critic, Walter Benjamin, famously said there is no work of art that is not also a work of barbarism. And what he's partly referring to is the sense that art can be a sop to take our minds off of the real world and real problems. And he cites in particular the stunning discovery by American troops when they went into the death camps after World War II of German soldiers lounging in lounge chairs and listening to the music of Franz Schubert while bodies are going up in smoke. So if you think about the kind of enjoyment that a Schubert song would provide in those circumstances, you can see the kind of critique of art that's being made in the aftermath of World War II. Terry Eagleton, the critic, the Marxist critic, talks about art appealing to the aesthetic realm. That is, it provides us a place where we can sympathize with other people, feel really bad for the poor and downtrodden, to such an effect that when we walk down the street, we don't need to feel guilty about not giving any money to beggars because we felt sorry for them in books. So it's that sense that art is seen to like sanitize reality and to evade it. And it's for that reason, too, that some people think the ending of Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, is a kind of sleight of hand in which problems are overlooked to get a happy ending, because Septimus kills himself, and she goes into that room aside and says, well, too bad. It'll spoil my party. And then she gives him a few minutes of thought and goes back and has her party. So the sense that the moderns aestheticize reality and manipulate symbols and make it not real is seen to be kind of artificial, and it raises debate in it's raised debate in contemporary discussions of literature as to the relative value of the aesthetic over the ethical, which is more important. Some critics of the moderns will say that they give the illusion of coherence and transcendence, of reaching a discovery at the expense of leaving things out. So the effect is elitist and at worst reactionary. Ulysses was billed as a book that was going to be sexually liberating. It broke laws. It was illegal in the United States for 12 years. It broke rules. It broke the law. It was supposed to be a revolutionary, and yet, what does it do? It gets you to look things up in reference books and sit at a desk. How liberating is that? And then, in the view of some writers of postmodern theory, particularly those who have been like canny to the recurrence of images of the apocalypse in the literature we've been reading, we've reached the end of history and the end of narrative. There's nothing else to be told. There's nothing any individual can do today that's going to be different from anything that anybody's done in the past. And even if you do anything significant, the SWAT team is going to be there to mop it up within 10 minutes. So the sense is that we're living in a monolithic, closed world of language and symbols and capital in which nothing is different. Nothing is really different. Nothing can be original anymore in this view. What's being original? Go to the library in the reference room and look at a table of people writing their papers, and they're all sitting there like that, being original, doing the same thing. Or think about the word freedom as it's interpreted in postmodern culture. You have freedom, you can do anything you want to. So you get into your car and you get stuck in gridlock on the Golden Gate Bridge. What's the difference between freedom and imprisonment in that sense? Some of the high concepts that the moderns try to valorize get deflated in postmodern theory. So there's also the sense that all attempts at meta-narrative or explanations of wrapping up meaning are bankrupt and corrupt. So postmodernism also, it claims to dissolve the artificial and arbitrary boundaries that separate high and low culture. And so it sees itself as a reaction to the elitism of the modernism, its institutionalization. Advocates of postmodern art would claim that Picasso might have been a good artist, but he was an even better marketer who was good at dealing with agents and salespeople and getting his work installed in museums. And other people will point out that the ideal reader of Ezra Pound or James Joyce is somebody in graduate school, so that these people writing novels are writing for an elite and a small group of people. In consequence, is a reaction against the what was perceived as the elitism of high modern art. Maybe you see this most strongly in Pound with his quotations from every language in the world. A reaction that results in the appearance of artists like Andy Warhol, creating like replicas of Campbell soup cans or of Marilyn Monroe, or of John Cage in music, who starts to write aleatoric music. This means music that's generated by chance. Aleatory or aleatoric. Or in Samuel Beckett, he starts cultivating a style that has no style. He started writing in Joyce's style, very ornate and rococo, and after World War II, he started writing in French so that his writing didn't get interesting. It stayed flat. Geez, in one of his novels, he says, in this reduction of the literature exhaustion, I'm going to tell 3 stories, one about a man, one about an animal, and one about an object. And then within one paragraph, he says, to hell with the animal. So Nabokov is engaged in this kind of postmodern movement, too, because he's drawing on all kinds of pop culture and all the movies and comic books and junk literature, which he parodies and makes the subject of his art. But I would argue that what the postmodern theorists say, that modern art is high culture and disregards and contemns low culture. It's not true. There was always a tendency to look at low culture in modern literature, which we can see in Joyce, for example, whose characters like looking at commodities of the early 20th century. In the book he writes after Ulysses Finnegan's Wake, one of his sources is a book called Read 'em and Weep, The World's Worth Jokes, one of which I'm tempted to tell. A man may laugh through the whole of a farce, a man may laugh through the whole of a play, but a man can't laugh through the hole in his arse because he just wasn't built that way. So in postmodern, people who theorize postmodern will also say that this art dissolves the distinction between art and life, that instead of producing kinds of art that are installed in museums where the wealthy and elite go or taught in graduate schools, it's a kind of art that happens on the street. And so in postmodern culture, you find things like The Happening or situational art appearing. Situational art, it's where people agree to do something disruptive in ordinary circumstances. One of my visits to Dublin, Ireland, I was walking down the street enjoying the view, and there was a line of women, all of them wearing these Clarabelle clown wigs, flaming red, wearing black tuxedos with shorts and carrying little briefcases, walking in a file. And they just, the one in the front of the line blew a whistle and they all lay down on their backs and started doing bicycles. So I went up to the one at the end of the line and said, "Who are you people?" And she said, "Oh, we're a group of traveling physicians." So that's situational art. Then Herbert Marcuse, another member of the Frankfurt School who taught down at San Diego for a long time, theorized The Happening as a place where all the energies and joys of a culture could be activated and brought together democratically in the street, so that art, the meeting of people in common in public could be a work of art instead of, say, reading a book alone in your room as a work of art. On the other, and we see this in Nabokov too, that in Lolita, the hero of the book is a reader. Something real, because you as a reader of the book are a real thing and not fictional, and Nabokov is constantly making you aware of the act of reading. So in postmodern literature too, there's a rejection of totalizing theory, of global theory, of essentialism, of universalism, of meta-narrative, the sense that if you try to have a theory that wraps everything up, you're always going to leave something out and disregard it. And so again, a kind of emphasis on the pastiche or the fragment. So I guess I will have implied in what I've said that I see a lot of what people take as distinct in postmodern literature, at least, growing out of and imminent already in modern literature. It's already there, I think. The moderns develop these insights that the postmoderns claim as their own and put into play. So is art dead? If we're in an era where people are proclaiming the literature of exhaustion and saying there are no new stories to be told, my sense of it is that it's not. There are fantastic things, fantastic novels and poems being written these days. In the word novel, the area of literature in which I specialize as a professional, it means new, novel. Implicit in the idea of the novel is novelty. What makes the novels that we read good is that they're all novel. They do something that prior novels didn't do, and they expand the horizons of what literature and this kind of writing can accomplish. My sense of what happens is happening with the novel now in the future is that there are still writers who are perfecting traditional forms of the traditional novel. Saul Bellow is a writer like that. He's writing about people who are identifiably real citizens of real cities dealing with middle-class life. And Faulkner and Hemingway are kind of in this class too. They're dealing with traditional stories. The novel is also going in the direction of metafiction, a sample of which we got in looking at Nabokov and Barth's short story. Beckett is writing in this vein too, and a lot of other writers, David Marx and Robbe-Grillet in France, who invents something called a new novel, which is kind of a tautology if you think about it, since novel means new. And there's actually now in France something called a nouveau roman, the new novel, or to translate it, the new. Sounds like advertising. And then there's a kind of, in keeping with the critique launched by the postmodern critics, the borderline between fiction and reality is dissolving its forms of novel that approach what's called a new journalism, where a novelist will take up a real story. Truman Capote famously in Cold Blood, where he writes the story of the Clutter Clutter family in Kansas, or Norman Mailer in The Executioner's Song, a 1,000-page book about the life of Gary Gilmore based on interviews that he did with Gilmore and all his relatives. And a 1,000-page novel by Norman Mailer in which Norman Mailer doesn't appear. Phenomenal. And then most importantly, I think, in the novel, there's an opening of vocalization, signs of which we got in reading Wolfe and Toomer. And by opening vocalization, what I mean is that novels are now giving expression to more kinds of voices and forms of experience that just weren't represented in the early part of the century. And so now the English literary canon is coming to include not just American and English and Irish works, but Anglophone works being written in South Africa, India, and third world countries. All those places unexpressed and unrepresented. So that's my general overview of the material we've looked at and of where it leads us. And I've also tried to give you a sense of, like, since this is 45C, the culminating course in the survey course that's shoved down your throats, I wanted to relate what we've studied this semester to what came before in 45B, most notably. So I might talk about the Great Transformation. So let me close by saying how much I've enjoyed the course and interacting with those of you who have come to talk and wonder about the literature with me, either in office hours or in discussions after class, or on the way to back to Wheeler Hall. You're all probably aware at some level that teaching is a symbiotic kind of process, that if students don't show interest in the materials teaching or in what you're saying as a teacher, then the teacher gets demoralized and doesn't put work into the course. And conversely, if the teacher doesn't show an interest in the stuff he's teaching and put work into the course, the students lose interest too. The course meant something to me, not only because of the literature I put on the list. I love all this literature. That's why I asked you to read it with me. But also because of the dedicated and hardcore group of you who came and attended regularly and who shared their interest in the works with me, and also because of my distinguished and excellent GSIs who have made this course a success. So I'm proud of you all of you who did all the reading, for the work you put into the course. It was a lot of reading, and as you know, a lot of it was just bearish, very difficult to read, but also, I hope, exciting and entertaining and rewarding. And it's my hope further that those of you who enjoyed some of the stuff we read will now go on and explore it further, and with more intensity in some upper division courses that specialize on some of these writers. And I hope that some of you return to it and consult this literature as you move through life and see it deepening. That's my spiel. Thank you for being part of this class.